Welcome to the Koi Farmer, where we focus on cultivating clarity in the complicated world of pharmacy benefits. I'm Justine. I'm a pharmacist with 20 years of experience in the business of pharmacy, and today we're kicking off our Drug Pricing Index series, talking about AWP, or Average Wholesale Price. There are several different indexes in the United States that are used as a basis for purchasing or selling pharmaceutical products. AWP happens to be the cornerstone of many of those contracts and something that flows throughout the industry but is not well understood. So today we're going to start by breaking down AWP. Let's dive in.
You're looking for the cure, but you're stuck in the weeds, bringing you insights into pharmacy.
We're going to start today by breaking down the acronym. What is AWP? What does it stand for? What does it mean? We'll move on talking about how it works, how it's developed in the industry, and some parallel concepts both within and outside of the pharmaceutical industry. Moving on to talking about AWP in practice, we'll talk about when AWP is used in contracting, some pros and cons of this drug pricing index, how this impacts payer decisions, and then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how AWP increases can impact different players in the drug channel. So a lot of folks in the industry like to joke that AWP stands for ain't what's paid. And honestly, they're not that far off. It actually stands for average wholesale price. But it doesn't necessarily represent an average. It's not connected to wholesale pricing, especially for generics. And it's highly rarely the actual price paid by any player in the value chain. So let's talk about how AWP gets set. So the first step in the process is the manufacturer ultimately sets the product pricing strategy and lists an AWP at launch. This listing is available only via proprietary compendia sources. So this means that the general public is not able to access AWP. Manufacturers report these pricing into these proprietary compendia sources, which typically include First Data Bank or Medispan. As I said, the patient is generally unaware of the drug's AWP because they cannot access this information publicly. When the patient goes to the pharmacy, they're generally going to pay less than the AWP for the drug when they get to the pharmacy. And then finally, as is common in the pharmacy benefits industry, rebates may occur on these particular products, but AWP remains unimpacted by any rebates. Some people find it helpful to think about parallel concepts outside of the industry. So I want to offer an example that rolls through how automobile pricing works in the United States. So in this case, the manufacturer sets the product pricing strategy just like in the case of AWP and drugs. The pricing list is available via proprietary manufacturer dealer portals that only the dealers can access. The dealer displays a different price, generally higher than MSRP, on that particular product that's for purchase for the customer. The customer generally pays less than MSRP for the automobile at the end of the day. And similar to the pharmaceutical industry, there can be rebates in the auto industry, and MSRP remains unimpacted by those rebates. There's another concept within the pharmaceutical industry that is running in parallel to AWP, and this concept is the wholesale acquisition cost. One of the goals of this channel is to provide information that helps folks understand some of the rules of thumb of the industry, and this is certainly one of them. So for the vast majority of drugs, the AWP is approximately 1.2 times the WAC, or wholesale acquisition cost. In some cases, this spread can be different, but what I want to try to do is break down some of these concepts and help people understand the most common permutations that flow through the industry. So moving on, I want to talk about how AWP is used in the industry, some pros and cons for payers and pharmacies, and how AWP impacts payer contract decision-making across the industry. The average wholesale price is the basis for most PBM contracts with pharmacies and plan sponsors. So on this slide, I have an example of a PBM contract with a pharmacy. So in a very basic version, they may say that generic drugs are contracted on a basis of AWP minus 91% across all the generic drugs, and all the brand drugs will average out to AWP minus 20%. Obviously, there are many more terms that go into a contract like this, but this is the quintessential crux of the contract. Moving on, PBMs will then go ahead and package and sell the ability for plan sponsors to be able to purchase drugs on a similar basis. In this case, generic drugs would be sold to the plan sponsor at AWP minus 89% on average, and brand drugs would be sold to the plan sponsor at AWP minus 19.5% on average. You'll notice that in this case, the plan sponsors are purchasing products for slightly more than the pharmacies are paid. In this case, the PBM may take some margin on these claims in order to facilitate operations to pay the claims electronically. So, what are some pros and cons of AWP? First, let's start with what makes AWP sticky in the industry. This is a comprehensive index, so every product, every NDC or national drug code that gets launched in the market generally will go live on First Databank or Medispan, and on the first day of launch, they will have an AWP and a WAC listed in a very comprehensive manner. Next, although there's some debate about this in the industry, this is a relatively predictable index for long-term modeling. Brand AWP inflates somewhat over time, but on a relatively stable basis. And lastly, and probably most importantly, transitioning away from AWP would require renegotiation across the supply chain, which could include PBMs having to renegotiate contracts with pharmacies and also having to renegotiate contracts with plan sponsors. What are some things that make AWP tricky? So we talked about this in the beginning. The pricing is set by the manufacturer. It's not necessarily overseen or reported by any regulatory body. And then finally, changes in AWP can impact member payments, and we'll review a little bit of those impacts in the fine print section. Next, I would like to review an example of how AWP can flow through and impact the payer decisions, or the decisions that the plan sponsors are making surrounding which pharmacy benefits manager or PBM they would want to do business with to process their pharmacy claims. So this is a very oversimplified spreadsheet that a consultant would use to be able to project costs forward for PBM A and PBM B. For the purposes of this example, the consultant has set the AWP projection equal across PBM A and PBM B. Next, as you look at the value of the brand discount, the value of the generic discount, and the value of the specialty discount, you can see that the discounts vary slightly, giving a little bit of an advantage to PBM B. And although this is not commonly the case, in this particular example, I've set the rebate to be equal amongst the two PBMs to show how the AWP can drive the decision. As we review the offer from the two PBMs, we can see that PBM B has offered more favorable discounts to the plan sponsor, and ultimately, that would lead them to project a lower net projected spend for PBM B than for PBM A. And as this plan sponsor is looking to select the PBM they will be going forward and doing business with, they would be more likely to select PBM B given their more favorable discounts. So we've reviewed some of the basics of AWP, we've talked about how it's used in practice, and now it's time to get down to the fun part, some of the fine print of how AWP flows through the industry. It's important to note foundationally that the goal of this channel is to really somewhat oversimplify some of the industry concepts to make them a little bit more digestible and to show some really common trends that can happen when different price points or different indexes can move. The examples that I have here are not necessarily one size fits all, so there could be a lot of different permutations on specific drugs, specific benefit designs, specific situations involving Medicaid reimbursement, and some ancillary outcomes for manufacturers that could potentially complicate the story. What we're going to go through here are a couple of examples of some different benefit designs and brand and generic drugs, and what happens when AWP increases in a couple of those scenarios, typically with some of the biggest players in the drug value chain. So we're going to start off with an example of a brand drug where the member has a high deductible health plan in play. So in this example, AWP has a 5% increase that has taken place on this brand drug. In this case, the PBM will generally have a higher gross margin, either from network spread or margin on what they're paying pharmacies versus what they're invoicing plan sponsors, or potentially from increased rebate retention depending upon the contract structure with the plan sponsors. Plan sponsors will generally have higher costs in this instance. They may not have necessarily a full 5% increase, and that's because in a high deductible health plan, the member may be absorbing more of the increase than the plan. In the case of the manufacturer is generally going to be able to immediately sell their drug to pharmacies and wholesalers for about 5% more. There can be some other implications to Medicaid pricing and some of the Inflation Reduction Act pricing, which we're not going to get into here, but will be covered in a future series. The pharmacies will experience a greater cost from the manufacturer relatively immediately. However, they also sell to the PBMs on the basis of AWP. So even though they buy for more, they're also selling their product for more, making this really quite a neutral event for pharmacies. And then finally, in the case where the member has a high deductible health plan, for example, they need to spend $3,000 or $5,000 before their insurance starts picking up the tab, the member may experience up to a 5% increase immediately on their drugs at the pharmacy counter. Next, we're going to talk about that same example of a brand drug, but with a different plan design. So in this example, say that the member has a $30 copay on branded products. When the AWP increases, the member is going to continue to pay the same. So what happens for the rest of the players in the channel in this case? Again, the PBM will be able to gain more margin either from network spread or from rebates. The plan sponsor is generally going to absorb a higher portion of this, potentially the entire portion of this AWP change in brand drugs. The manufacturer will again be able to increase their gross revenue by 5%. The pharmacy is buying and selling on related indexes, so this is a neutral event again for the pharmacy. And the member in this case will generally still pay $30 for their drug at the counter, so remains unimpacted. Next, we're going to talk through an example of how this works in generic drugs, and it is a little bit different than it works for brands. So in this example, the member again is back to that high deductible plan. So in the case of the PBMs generally pull a little bit more margin from generics than they do from brands in cases of network spread. So depending upon their contract with the plan sponsor, the PBMs may really increase their margin significantly as AWP goes up on a particular generic product. Plan sponsors will bear some of the brunt of increased cost as members hit their deductible, as members hit their out-of-pocket max, and the plan sponsors have to pick up the rest. For the manufacturer in this case, manufacturers are more commonly selling product in the generic realm on more of a net price basis. Or if they're not selling products on that type of basis, the pharmacies have different manufacturers they're able to choose from. And so increasing the price from the manufacturer's standpoint may lead to volume reduction of the manufacturer's sales. Pharmacies are generally purchasing from the manufacturers on a relatively flat basis, and they're being paid by the PBMs, generally at the maximum allowable cost, or MAC. We'll have another module talking about MAC in more detail, but the important thing to note here is they're purchasing on a relatively stable price and selling to the PBM at a similar price no matter how the AWP moves. Lastly, in this case, the member would experience an immediate increase in their cost at the pharmacy if their deductible or out-of-pocket max has not been met. In this last example, we'll talk through generic drugs in the event of a flat member copay. So for example, the member has a copay of $10 on all generic products. So again, the PBM is reimbursing the pharmacies at MAC. They may be able to increase what they're charging plan sponsors based on the way that the contract is structured around AWP, so they could increase their margin anywhere between 5 and 45%. Plan sponsors will bear the brunt usually of a lot of the cost of this increase, so they may pay 2 to 5% more. Manufacturers, again, are not necessarily making more from AWP increases and may in fact have negative consequences in Medicaid reimbursement for increasing AWP in generics. Pharmacies continue to have a neutral event, and the member is typically going to still pay their flat copay of $10. Thanks for joining us on this journey to learn about AWP, or Average Wholesale Price. This is one of many drug pricing indexes that we will review in our Drug Pricing Index series. We hope you learned a thing or two in this episode and that you'll tune in for some of our future updates in other drug pricing indexes in the industry. We hope that if you gain some value out of this video, that you'll consider liking, subscribing, and if you have any feedback, please provide that. We also offer training packages and consulting services, which you can access information on or contact us on our website, www.thekoifarmer.com. Thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you next time.
You're looking for the cure, but